So thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah, so the question is who gets read? As I tell my philosophy students, philosophy is much better in asking questions than answering them. So I will not give an answer to this question, kind of obviously. But yeah, I mean, the problem, I suppose, is quite well known, right? So, I mean, what do we read, right? We don't have time to read everything that we would like to read, perhaps even things that we ought to read, we can't read. And one way to cash this out is to think of our attention as a limited cognitive resource, right? So we need to spend it somehow, we have a limited amount of it. There might be papers that we would like to read, but we can't. There are papers that we definitely don't want to read, but we kind of end up reading them anyways. The kind of bad stuff, right? The crank stuff. Fenner was kind enough to mention my paper on cranks, and here's a quote that I talk about in that paper. That comes from the Académie Royale in 1778. It goes like this: the Academy has resolved this year not to examine in the future any solutions to the problem of doubling of the cube, the trisection of the angle, and the squaring of the circle, or of any machine which lays claim to perpetual motion. An experience extending over more than 70 years has convinced the Academy of the little value that would accrue to science were the examination of these pretended solutions to be continued. Right? So what is the Academy telling us here? Look, we don't have enough resources to spend our attention on this. We want to think about serious work, and this is kind of cranky, so we're gonna ignore this at the outset, just by topic, right? Regardless of how good or probably bad the argument actually is. So it's a filtering mechanism, right? It kind of lacks relevant markers of excellence, if you will. Right? Now, this can be digitally mediated, right? So how our attention is driven can be digitally mediated. And now I recognize, especially in light of yesterday's talks, that this quotation, because it comes from the archive, but it goes back to a paper published in 2016. So yesterday we were told that everything that old is completely outdated. But it still, I guess, makes that point about how attention might be digitally mediated. So here we have Ginsburg in a wonderful paper, by the way. I highly recommend reading this, even if it might be outdated by now. But you know, so he was trying to fix issues about proper allocation of keywords and search terms and so on for submissions to the archive. And well, he says, well, if you actually had submissions to archives that were not spotted by the moderators, but are spotted by this automated program that was written to kind of make sure that that the keywords match and other things like author names and so on. All I was trying to do is build a simple text classifier, and inadvertently I built what I call the holy grail of crackpot filtering. So yet again, we have some kind of means of sorting out how we spend our attention at the outset, right? But here we actually let a machine do this. Right? Okay. So why is any of this relevant? Because attention, where we spend our attention, is epistemologically relevant. What does that mean? It shapes kind of how mathematical knowledge, and knowledge in general, is produced. Right? So attention is a relevant dimension of knowledge production. Here's a phrasing of this that I take from Katarina Duto-Novage, who says, for argumentative engagement, proper sender-receiver relations need to be in place. And now these sender-receiver relations, today I'm focusing on the concept of attention here, but you could make very similar points using concepts such as visibility, trust, reputation, authority, power, and so on. Right? But the very idea is that for an argument to actually get off the ground, to engage with that argument, first of all, there needs to be somebody who sends out the argument, right? The sender and the receiver who is then listening or not, right? And we all know this from teaching, right? The teacher might be sending, but the students might not be receiving because they're playing on their phone. I guess that's well known today. Similarly, the teacher might not be sending if it's a tutor and has not been paid. You know, the sender might refuse to send in. So even before we get into the engagement with the content of an argument, of a mathematical proof in our case, we need to have these kind of proper sender-receiver relations in place. So that's the topic of my talk today. And I've given you two examples already where these kind of relations were disrupted to avoid cognitive overload, right? So the kind of information overflow that you get when you have too many crank submissions to the Académie Royale, you know, that they can't handle all of this, they don't want to handle all of it. So you disrupt it by just saying, well, okay, dear sender, you can send, but we are no longer receiving, right? We disrupt these kind of these proper sender-receiver relations as a means to avoid this kind of cognitive overload. On the archive, perhaps that was not intended as a means to avoid cognitive overload, but it turned out, and in the article that I mentioned, Ginsberg was quite happy about this kind of that, you know, we now have some kind of digitally mediated disruption of sender-receiver relations. In this case, a sender is just blocked from sending, right? So the sender does not get into the archive proper, if you will. Okay, so yesterday we then kind of focused a lot on how to filter out low-quality contributions, right? And we were talking about reviewing, about moderation, potentially automation of this, right? So what we're interested in there, and much of the stuff, much of the talks today, were also about a similar topic, namely the kind of the engagement with the content, right? So is the proof formally correct? Is it, you know, does it compile and lean, and so on, right? Now the sender-receiver relations are in a sense before then, right? So before we engage with the argument, before we check the correctness of proofs and check whether something compiles or not, it's a kind of sociological question about who actually gets to send and who gets to receive, right? So who is read, right? Okay, so the question then is kind of, okay, let's, right, whilst this is certainly a relevant question, how to ensure kind of that, you know, how to filter out low quality contributions, and we discussed many issues yesterday, and they're serious issues, I'm not denying this here, but what about kind of good, high quality contributions? So what happens when you know, the correctness of the proof is no longer at stake? Right? Will it then, what happens then? Will it then be seen? Will it be read? Will it be, right? How does it circulate, right? And I guess here comes into, here's the point then that, you know, questions about kind of relevance and significance and novelty and fruitfulness and so on are not determined by proof, right? I mean, this even goes for novelty, right? So I mean, so Fenner and I and Jean-Paul van Bendeghem have a paper on this, right? Where the question, one of the key questions is novel for whom, right? So does the small elite crowd need to know, or, you know, how big of a research community do you need to have for something to count as new, right? Who already knows stuff? When is something new? Even that is a kind of has sociological dimensions, right? Well, okay, this goes for proofs, but it extends to, you know, definitions, research questions, stream of research. Now, when we think about these sender-receiver relations, one of the points that we can pick up from the literature is quite quickly is that kind of environments matter, right? So in the environments in which we argue kind of have an impact on how these sender-receiver relations work, or in the context of this talk, on attention, right? So one of the things that is talked about in public discourse today are kind of echo chambers and epistemic bubbles, right? So epistemic bubbles are where the like-minded talk amongst themselves, and the echo chambers are epistemic bubbles that actively exclude other opinions, right? So we might think of conspiracy theory, right? I I like flat Earth theory as a kind of pet example here, right? Where you might be in an echo chamber and say, well, okay, we're actively pushing out anybody who denies flat Earth theory, right? We believe the Earth is flat, everybody else is just silly and misguided. And there are two ways the literature looks at this, right? So one is the kind of a deficit account of rationality, right? So we might say, okay, somebody in this kind of echo chamber or epistemic bubble might just fail to meet the kind of normative standards of what it is to be rational, right? It is rational to engage also in conflicting opinions and then update our views and maybe come to the realization that, well, actually the Earth is not flat, right? But then there are these non-ideal accounts of rationality. And one way to get this off the ground is with a kind of thought experiment, what we philosophers like to do so much. So think of a cultist, right? Somebody who grows up in a cult. Let's call him Colin, so that we have the cultist Colin. Maybe he's even cute. Then we have the cute cultist Colin. And the cute cultist Colin believes in flat Earth theory because the entire cult believes in flat Earth theory. Right? So the parents of Colin believes in flat Earth theory, and the teachers, and so on. Right? So we might then say, well, Colin is kind of virtuously, if you will, attributing experthood to, you know, his relevant peers, so to parents, to teachers, and to other kind of leading figures. So Colin is doing everything right in some sense about attributing expertise. Nonetheless, believes, of course, in flat Earth theory. Right? So here we might say, well, this person is rational believing in something we take to be irrational. Right? So that would be a non-ideal account of rationality. So we take into account the messiness of the descriptions of actual human epistemic activity. Right? And then we come to the realization that rationality in these kind of broader contexts might be, it might not just be a single norm, but we might follow this kind of descriptive account of what it means to be rational. Right? Now, epistemic bubbles, of course, kind of connect closely to kind of this digitally mediated salience. So what does salience mean, right? What becomes kind of interest and of importance to us. And we have this in the digital space in very easy ways, such as the YouTube algorithms and so on, right? So suggestions and on Netflix and various social media platforms and so on. So this will guide our attention, right? So what we actually end up reading. And the point I wish to make, I guess, is that this will also impact what we as mathematicians, or you as mathematicians, since I'm not one, but what mathematicians take to be of interest and of relevance, right? So one topic I mentioned already is kind of keywords, and the Ginsberg quote was connected to that we need the kind of right search terms to find what we're looking for, and this will kind of guide our attention in some way. Well, these things are connected to the kind of metrics. Well, I discovered this too early, but to the metrics of scientific research, right? So what comes up in search queries is connected to what is highly cited and so on, right? And this happens in AIs as well, right? So AIs will look at what is used a lot and what is talked about a lot. So they use certain metrics to make something salient, right? And here's the basic wisdom of scientometrics that I revealed too early. That metrics don't just measure science, right? They change it, right? So we use search terms, and the system will spit out something. The algorithm will spit out something, and this is then what we focus on, right? So what that means, I guess, is that that the digital infrastructures that we use can reshape our attention economies, right? And now this is not a story about good or bad, right? So this is not just a story about change, right? It's a story about change that hasn't really been looked at a lot from, at least from the philosophical perspective and from the sociology of mathematics neither. So there's very little on how our attention economies and how kind of the sociological aspects will be reshaped by the digital infrastructures that we're discussing here today. And with that, I'd like to thank you.